So thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks for the invitation. It might not sound like it, but I'm actually from around here. I mean, my parents are both born in Liverpool, and I was actually born in Blackpool, and I still have lots of family here, and I'm taking advantage of being here to catch up with them this evening. I think they've got something planned for me. Address, first of all, one of the questions that was asked right at the beginning about the composition of the panels, and I know most speakers have felt the need to do that. So I signed a pledge years ago that I would not be on a panel that didn't have women on it, as we have a Yeah, well, it was a good job you arrived. Exactly. But we call it seriously the No Manels Pledge. No manels allowed. And when I saw the makeup, I did actually speak to the organisers, and I was reassured by them, and I believe them. They had tried very hard to get a more representative lineup here. Otherwise, I would not have agreed to take part. Now, it's a tall order, isn't it, to convey in just a few minutes why we might want to stay in the EU. And even when we're talking to an audience, I can tell I'm talking to an audience that does believe that as passionately as I do. And I know we've had enough of experts, and I'm not an expert on the EU constitution. I'm just a lawyer who's worked most of his life in Brussels since I first went out there in 1984. And though I was away all that time, I continued to pay taxes to support, so UK taxes, I remained a UK taxpayer to support local services in the UK, even though I wasn't myself making much use of them. And I was happy to do that because my family mostly worked in the public sector. I'd had my education almost exclusively at the public expense, and I was very happy to be able to contribute. And I say that because I don't think it's often understood that many of us who are actually lucky enough, and we are lucky, to be able to exercise the free movement rights that we hear about, many of us do continue to have our base in the UK, we continue to be attached to the UK, and we contribute both financially and in many other ways to the economy here. Coming to today's topic, and we're in the era of crowdsourcing, so on the train today on the way up, I asked Twitter, so what are the key facts, what should I not forget to mention about the benefits of being in the EU? And I got quite a healthy response, actually. I was quite surprised how many people piled in. And a lot of them came up with very emotional concepts like family, friendship, peace, which Declan dealt with very well. And those are all good, and I do think our politicians particularly need to do that. We all wish they'd done more of that a couple of years ago. But I'm a lawyer, and I'm probably better able at dealing with more concrete concepts than that. I'm not standing for office. I have no intention of doing that. And one friend suggested, as I was coming here, he said it's very simple. He said you just have to screen 2 videos. One is of Jurgen Klopp talking about the benefits of the EU, and the other is that well-known diplomat Neil Warnock. And if you haven't seen the videos that I'm thinking of, you really should check them out on YouTube, because as a real contrast between an open-minded European and a very narrow-minded Brit, they're really hard to beat in about 2 minutes. The comedian Mike Harding responded. He said, it ought to be enough for me to mention just that the 2 biggest cheerleaders for Brexit, either vocally or through their funding, overt and covert, are Trump and Putin. And as he put it, the EU represents the largest social democratic bulwark against the 2 different versions of crony capitalism that we're facing at the moment. And somebody else picking up on that thread, and that's what I love about Twitter, the way that the threads grow and other people come in, well, that can be hard to follow sometimes, said that if you're confused about who to support, you just have to look at who's backing Brexit, including Farage, Rees-Mogg, Duncan Smith, Katie Hopkins, the Sun newspaper, and our very own Kate Hoey. But it can be too easy, can't it, to demonise our opponents, however tempting that might be. And so I wanted to try to look for positive reasons for being part of the EU, but also to get away from that sort of them and us thing, that language that we fall into when we talk about the EU, as though the UK and the EU are different things, as though we're not part of the same continent, as though we're not part of the same club. But also to look not just on what they've done for us, taking President Kennedy's line, not just what they've done for us, but what we can do for them, what we have done for them. And as Rajid Khan said earlier today, look not just at what we've gained, but what we've actually contributed. And I think it's really often not understood, and it should be better understood, how much this supposed EU superstate that people talk about is actually very much our creation. That the UK, together with a group of quite relatively small group of member states, played a very large part in making the EU the body that it is and the way it looks today. And I think sometimes it's interesting to look at some of the key arguments that get thrown back against us, and then look at the reality from the standpoint of what the UK's contribution was, and maybe, as Gary Miller said earlier, to look at the small print. And it can be painful to do that sometimes, but we do need to. Just to take a few examples. Fish and fisheries, they get a huge amount of attention in our press, even though it's really a tiny industry within our economy. In 2018, the total value of fish landed by UK vessels was about £950 million. Now you can contrast that with my own industry, legal services, which to the UK economy is worth around £35 billion, and of that we have net exports of around £4 billion. Now I appreciate men and women in suits going to offices doesn't have the same romantic appeal as people going out in boats into the North Sea. I can see why that's the case, and I don't want to knock the concerns of the fishing industry. I think we should care about them. We have to recognise, though, that it was our government's decisions, or many governments, different parties actually, if we're honest, decisions over time to sell off the bulk of our fishing licences to a few small companies, a number of them foreign-owned. So the state of our fishing industry is partly down to us. But the common fisheries policy, as currently structured at least, is largely improved because of a campaign that the UK led in the early 80s, which gave greater access to British boats and also put a heightened emphasis on conservation, without which we wouldn't be looking at the industry we are looking at now. Another criticism we often hear is that since we joined what they call the common market, and obviously they just don't read the letter that Ted Heath wrote to everybody about what this meant at the time, but since joining the common market, the EU has changed out of all recognition. But in fact, the biggest change in my lifetime, well, obviously it's all in my lifetime, isn't it? You forget the EU actually isn't that old, or our membership. And the one that was largely inspired by the UK, and the reason that I and many others like me went out to live in Brussels in the late 1980s, was the launch of something called the 1992 programme. It was the programme to create or to complete the single market, launched in 1988. That, again, was driven very much by the UK and by British commissioners. And the main contribution we made to that, in that process, was to expand the EU from goods to services. Now, unfortunately, when the BBC wants to show something on its screens about demonstrating our trade with the EU, they normally show something like a car factory or a container ship. And that's understandable because it's easier to show something tangible like that on film. And it's important because 48% of our goods exports go to the rest of the EU. But as we all know, we have a large goods deficit with the EU. It's about 95 billion at present. And our economy is 80% services. But in services, we have a surplus with the EU of around 30 billion. And those who push Brexit have no plan how we're going to deal with our services industries. They have no plan for what we're going to do when we tear up all of those rules that allow us to trade efficiently in services with the rest of the EU. And take someone like me. I mean, I can either, as I do at the moment, largely from the UK, provide my services cross-border to clients in the rest of the EU, or I can go to my office in Brussels where I'm entitled to my right of establishment, and I can sit and work there just as any other EU-admitted lawyer can. But those who talk about leaving the EU on WTO terms, which actually I call it leaving on WTF terms, because I don't think they have a clue what we're going to do about it. They have no idea how to deal with services. Another big issue is immigration. Now, of course, it is a big issue, but it gets discussed as though it's something that's been imposed on us. The immigration we face now is something that's been imposed on us by the other member states. But the reality is that we were the leading advocate during the 1990s of expanding Europe to the east. Now, it's said we did that cynically. It said we did it because we wanted to broaden rather than deepen. We wanted a wide but shallow EU rather than a close but deep EU. And I think there was some cynicism there. But that programme also was led by a British commissioner. It was our choice when those countries who we'd argued should come in, when they came in, it was our choice not to take advantage of the ability to have transitional arrangements. We could have done that. We decided not to do that. Subsequently to that, we have constantly not taken advantage of the rights we have under the treaty and under the delegated legislation to limit the free movement of non-workers, because it's a right to move in pursuit of employment. We could have made it far more difficult for people to come who didn't have a job offer, or to stay if they didn't acquire a job within a 3-month period. We chose not to do that. Now, I'm not saying that I personally think either of those were mistakes. I'm pro-immigration. But if we want to say it was a mistake, It was our mistake. It wasn't the EU's mistake. The tabloids keep going on about how we've lost control to unelected bureaucrats, although I don't know where you find elected bureaucrats in Europe, but it was us. The thing we have to remember, we're the ones, partly because of enlargement, because of this community growing and therefore the problems of management, we decided that was inefficient. We were the ones who pushed for majority voting. We said unanimity doesn't work any longer. We have to have majority voting. Then we had QMV, qualified majority voting. And we knew that would mean we would occasionally lose a vote. But we lose very few votes. We've lost very few. You see lots of different figures, but the one that seems to have more credibility is that if you count about 2,500 votes, and of course many things don't get voted on, because many things get done by consensus, but out of 2,500 votes, we've been on the losing side in about 75. And a good number of those are actually on issues we didn't care about because they covered areas where we had opt-outs. But at the same time, while we were exercising all this influence in Europe, we had a very large rebate. We had, as I said, opt-outs on areas that were most sensitive to us, like justice and home affairs, and the Schengen free travel arrangements, although I don't know, presumably because we love queuing. I mean, why would we not want to be in Schengen? It's a complete pain. But anyway, and we were out of the euro. So we had, and still have, the best deal going in Europe. The others can't believe that we're giving this up, having fought so hard for all of these advantages. And looking at the positive side as well, we made a great impact on the culture of the EU. We made the administration far more efficient. We introduced a lot of the discipline from our civil service model. A lot of our officials took up very senior and very influential positions. Sadly, most of them have retired now, not been replaced. And frankly, even if we don't end up leaving, and I'm one of those who actually believes we won't leave, partly because I think it's impossible, and I think if we were going to do it, we needed to start 10 years ago. We needed to put the brightest and best in charge of it. We clearly decided not to do any of that. So I don't see us getting out with the current lot in charge. But we had all that influence. The English language gave us a massive advantage, which should not be underestimated. When I first arrived as a trainee lawyer in 1984, I would call the commission. I'd be the one who'd have to call the commission to arrange a meeting. I didn't know if I was going to get a French, Italian, Greek, Spanish official on the other end of the line. I could assume that we'd be able to speak French. So if you spoke good English and good French, then you could function. But you'd have to assume you'd be speaking French. Many documents would come out, first of all, in French. But now, when we call the commission, you can just assume that whoever answers will speak to you in English. And that is I wouldn't underestimate the advantage of being able to do business in English across the EU. I'm not saying that will go. I think it's very entrenched now, but it has played a huge part in how influential we've been. So to wrap up, I think we gained so many benefits from the EU that have been underappreciated. I think we did far more to shape it than anybody would realise, certainly from reading our press and even from listening to our politicians, with a few honourable exceptions. I mean, whichever, and I've been in the Labour Party a long time, but I'm critical of us for having not made the positive case when we had the opportunity, and frankly the audience to have made it. When people were listening to us, we didn't take the opportunity to do that. It was too easy for us as well to blame Europe for everything that goes wrong. I responded earlier, there was a question from the audience before about procurement and about whether the Labour Party would be able to achieve its manifesto within the constraints of European law. The answer is there's a very good paper written on this that went through the last Labour manifesto and explained why every single one of the points that involves spending commitments, or to the extent you can identify a commitment in manifestos, and it's not always easy as we know, but to the extent there's a concrete commitment, all of them bar two could clearly be honoured within the current EU framework, and even the two, there were question marks about it, but they were doable. So it's a myth that the EU has stopped politicians doing what they want. It's too often been invoked as an excuse for not doing what they really didn't want to do. So whether it's procurement or other rules, they say, we'd love to do this, but EU law won't let us. It's rarely true. So I want to remain, but I do agree with Nick Dearden earlier. I don't want to go back to the status quo. I think it needed to be improved and reformed. I think it needs to be more radical. We need to be more radical, and I'd like to see us do that, but hopefully within. I hope it's not too late, even now, for us to get this message across. And I hope to see many of you on the march on March 23rd, if you can make it to London. So thanks very much.